was another late night at the office, the kind where the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant clatter of keyboards echoed through empty cubicles. Eric rubbed his tired eyes, the dull glow of the monitor casting shadows across his cluttered desk. He had stayed later than usual, buried in reports that no one would appreciate but everyone expected. The office was a skeletal shell now, stripped of its usual bustle, leaving only the cold silence and the occasional creak of settling walls. Eric slung his coat over his shoulder and grabbed his briefcase. The corridor stretched on endlessly, the flickering overhead lights casting elongated shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls. His footsteps echoed too loudly against the tile floors, making him painfully aware that he was alone. He pressed the elevator button, watching the numbers descend slowly, as if reluctant to reach him. Ding. The doors parted with a metallic groan, revealing an empty elevator bathed in a harsh, sterile light. Eric hesitated for a moment, just a flicker of something uneasy twisting in his gut, before stepping inside. He jabbed the button for the lobby, leaning back against the cool metal wall. The doors slid shut, and the elevator began its descent. The hum of the machinery was oddly soothing, a moment of quiet reprieve after a grueling day. But then, the lights flickered. Once, twice, and then the elevator jolted violently, as if something massive had grabbed the car and yanked it downward. Eric's stomach lurched. The control panel's numbers scrambled, blinking erratically before halting on B2. B2. Eric stared at the panel. There was no basement level 2. This building only had a single basement floor for storage and maintenance. His finger hovered over the alarm button, but before he could press it, the elevator chimed softly. Ding. The doors slid open. Beyond them stretched a long, dimly lit hallway. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, their weak glow illuminating a narrow corridor that seemed to stretch on without end. The walls were stained with something dark, and the air that drifted in was damp and cold, smelling faintly of mildew and rust. Eric's breath quickened. He hadn't pressed this floor. The hallway shouldn't exist. He jabbed at the control panel every button, over and over. Nothing happened. The doors refused to close. The elevator stood still, gaping open like a mouth waiting to swallow him. From somewhere deep in that impossible hallway, he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, growing louder. Eric's heart began to hammer in his chest. Eric's breath hitched as the steady rhythm of footsteps echoed from the endless corridor. They were distant but unmistakable, each step deliberate, slow and too heavy to be casual. The sound seemed to cling to the walls, growing louder, creeping closer. He hammered the close door button, frantic now. Nothing. The elevator stayed open, its bright interior a stark contrast to the suffocating darkness beyond. His reflection in the steel doors was pale, wide-eyed, and trembling. The footsteps didn't waver. Whoever or whatever was coming didn't care that he was trapped in his metal cage. His mind raced for logic. Maybe it was a maintenance worker. Maybe this was some forgotten level of the building, a floor he'd somehow never heard of. Yet the decay of the hallway, the stale, damp air, told him this place hadn't been touched in years, maybe decades. No, this wasn't part of the building. The footsteps paused. Eric froze. The silence pressed in, heavier than the darkness. Then they resumed. Faster now, closer. Eric's pulse roared in his ears. He turned, his eyes scanning the elevator for anything he could use. His briefcase, his keys. Pathetic. He was trapped, cornered like prey. The hallway gaped before him, and the thing approaching was hidden in shadow. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. He lunged forward and grabbed the edge of the elevator doors, trying to force them shut. They didn't budge. His palms burned as he shoved with all his strength, muscles trembling with effort. Nothing. It was as if something was holding them open, something stronger than him. The footsteps were so much closer now. Thud, thud. Eric's breath came in short, ragged gasps, his eyes strained against the dark, searching for movement, for any sign of the figure. The hallway seemed to pulse, like it was alive, stretching further the longer he looked. Then he saw it. At the very edge of the flickering light, just barely visible, something moved. A shadow peeled away from the wall, a shape too tall, limbs too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. It didn't walk. It glided, closing the distance with jerky, unnatural motions. Eric stumbled backward into the elevator, slamming himself against the back wall. He pounded on the panel, slapping every button, hitting the emergency alarm, but there was no sound, no response. The air was colder now, like it had followed him in, coiling around his neck. The figure didn't stop. It was nearing the threshold of the elevator doors. Then, the lights went out. For a second, maybe two, there was nothing. No light, no sound. And in that suffocating darkness, Eric heard it, breathing, right in front of him. Eric stood paralyzed in the suffocating blackness. The air had thickened, dense and damp, clinging to his skin. The sound of breathing slow, raspy, and wet filled the elevator. Too close, too human to be anything but right there. He didn't dare move. He didn't even breathe. It was so near that he could almost feel it, the exhale brushing across his cheek like a cold, damp whisper. The dark seemed to fold around him, pressing in, suffocating. His mind screamed to run, to fight, to do something. But there was nowhere to run. A faint rustling sound broke the stillness, like dry skin scraping against metal. Something was shifting in front of him, deliberate and slow. It knows I'm here. His shaking hand fumbled for his phone in his pocket. His fingers, slick with sweat, barely gripped it. He yanked it free and, without thinking, hit the screen. The faint glow of the display flickered to life. The light illuminated only inches ahead, just far enough to reveal a face, not fully human. Its skin was stretched impossibly thin over jagged bone, gray and cracked like old paper. Hollow black pits where eyes should have been stared straight at him. Its mouth, torn at the edges, hung half open, revealing crooked, splintered teeth. The breathing stopped, and it smiled. Eric's scream caught in his throat as the phone slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. The light from the screen spun wildly, casting warped shadows along the elevator walls. The thing didn't move. It just stared. Eric lunged forward in blind panic, slamming his fists into the control panel, clawing at buttons. He smashed his palm against the emergency stop, the open door button, the closed door button, anything. And then, miraculously, the elevator shuddered. The lights flickered back on, but the hallway beyond the doors was gone. In its place was the lobby. Eric gasped, stumbling forward into the lobby as the elevator doors slowly began to close behind him. He didn't dare look back. His legs carried him forward, nearly tripping over himself as he crossed the empty lobby. But just before the door shut, he heard it, a soft, deliberate exhale, and a faint whisper, so low it barely existed. Next time, the doors sealed shut. Eric bolted for the front exit, not stopping until the cold night air hit his face, sharp and biting. He didn't look back, not once. But as he fumbled for his car keys with trembling hands, one thing gnawed at the edge of his mind. The elevator shouldn't have stopped on B2, because that floor was never built. Eric sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath came in short, uneven gasps, fogging up the windshield. The cold night air seeping through the cracked window did little to calm the firestorm of panic inside him. He replayed the events over and over, The impossible floor, the endless hallway, that face. Eric's eyes flicked up to the office building looming in the rearview mirror. From the outside, it looked perfectly normal, just glass, steel, and brick. No hints of the nightmare that unfolded inside, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. Terribly wrong. His mind searched for logic. Maybe it was a power malfunction, a trick of the lights. Stress-induced hallucination, anything rational. But none of those explanations could explain that thing in the elevator, or what it whispered. Next time, Eric's stomach turned. His security badge. In his frantic escape, he hadn't noticed. It wasn't clipped to his coat anymore. He must have dropped it. Or worse, left it behind in the elevator. He reached for his phone to call building security, to report something, anything, but his fingers hovered above the screen. What would he even say? That the elevator took him to a non-existent floor, and something inhuman nearly cornered him. That the basement grew an extra level overnight. They'd think he was insane, but maybe someone else had seen something. He scrolled through his contacts and found Greg's number. Greg worked in IT on the second floor, always gossiping about office rumors. If anyone had heard anything weird, it would be him. Eric hesitated. His thumb hovered over the call button. No. He shoved the phone back into his pocket. The thought of talking about it out loud made it feel real. No one could help him now. He jammed the key into the ignition and drove off, the building shrinking in his rearview mirror until it was swallowed by the night. The next morning, Eric barely remembered falling asleep. His mind had been too restless, thoughts circling like vultures. But as the harsh morning light filtered through his blinds, something in his chest tightened. He knew he couldn't avoid it. He had to go back. Eric called in sick. He wasn't ready to step into that building again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't finished with him. Hours passed in a blur. He sat on his couch, staring blankly at the TV, watching, but not watching. Then his phone buzzed. A text from Greg. "Hey man, are you okay? I heard something weird." Eric's stomach flipped. "What do you mean?" he typed back. Moments later, Greg responded. "Your security badge was found in the elevator this morning. B2 button was lit up, but there's no B2. Eric's hands shook as he read the words. Greg followed up almost immediately. "Security checked the cameras, but they said the footage from last night is gone. Just blank, like nothing was recorded." Eric stared at the screen, the words blurring in his vision. Then Greg sent one last text. "Dude, they said the elevator doors were stuck open for hours, but when they checked inside, it was empty. Just your badge on the floor." Eric swallowed hard, bile rising in his throat. Empty. But Eric knew that wasn't true. He wasn't alone in that elevator. And maybe he never really left. Eric couldn't breathe. His mind spun as Greg's last message burned into his vision. The elevator was empty, just your badge on the floor. But Eric knew better. He remembered the breathing, the dark, hollow eyes. That thing had been in there with him, too close to deny. Yet somehow security only found his badge. Eric's reflection in the darkened TV screen stared back at him, haggard, pale, and sunken. "You're not crazy," he whispered to himself. "You're not crazy." But it didn't feel convincing. The room felt colder. His eyes drifted to the far corner of the room, where his coat hung limply on the back of a chair. His security badge should have been clipped to it. Seeing that empty spot sent a jolt through him. Greg's text replayed in his head. The B2 button was lit up. Eric's throat tightened. His phone vibrated again, snapping him back. Another message from Greg. "Dude, security's freaking out. One of the night guards quit this morning. Wouldn't say why. Just left. Weird, right?" Eric's grip on the phone tightened. Something was spreading, and it wasn't just him anymore. By evening, the sky had bruised into a deep purple, the city swallowed in shadows. Eric hadn't moved from his spot on the couch, but his mind refused to stay still. He had to know what was happening. Against every instinct screaming at him to forget, to run, Eric grabbed his laptop. He searched for blueprints of the office building, anything that could explain that B2 floor. But the plans were standard. Lobby. Floors 1 through 18. A single basement, B1 for storage. No B2s, no hidden sub-levels. It didn't exist. Yet it did. And then something caught his eye. In the building's online employee directory, Eric noticed something strange. A name. Maintenance, B2 division. But there was no B2. The employee's name was listed as Robert Hale, but next to it under status was one word. Deceased. Eric's skin crawled. He clicked the name, hoping for more details. But the page was empty, just a placeholder with a blank photo and a faded employee ID. No contact, no bio, just that word. Deceased. His heart pounded. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The next morning, Eric stood in front of the office building. It loomed taller than before, its glass facade reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. But Eric wasn't here to work. He wasn't sure why he was here at all. Maybe it was the unanswered questions. Maybe it was the sickening feeling in his gut. Or maybe it was because that whisper still lingered in his ears. Next time, the lobby buzzed with the hum of morning routines, coffee cups clinking, hurried footsteps, murmured conversations. Normal. But Eric's eyes locked on the elevators. One of them stood open, waiting, empty, drawing him in. He didn't remember deciding to move, but suddenly, he was inside. The door slid closed. The soft hum of descent began. He watched the glowing numbers count down. 10, 9, 8. Eric's breath quickened. 7, 6, 5. His finger hovered over the panel. The B1 button glowed faintly, and below it, a button he knew hadn't been there before. B2, cold metal beneath his fingertip. It was already lit. The elevator didn't slow. It just kept going down, and Eric understood now. This wasn't a choice. He was meant to come back. The elevator slowed. Ding. The doors creaked open, and the dark hallway waited. The doors yawned open, exhaling a stale, icy breath that wrapped around Eric like a noose. There it was again. The same endless, dimly lit hallway. The flickering overhead lights sputtered weakly, casting long, spidery shadows that seemed to stretch toward him. The air was heavier this time, thick with the scent of damp concrete and something metallic, like rust or blood. Eric's legs felt like lead, but something deeper than fear pulled him forward. It wants me here. His footsteps echoed unnaturally loud, swallowed quickly by the oppressive silence. The walls on either side were cracked and stained, the peeling paint forming shapes that resembled faces if he stared too long. He didn't dare. Every instinct in his body screamed to turn back. But when he glanced over his shoulder, the elevator doors had already closed. There was no button to call it back. Eric swallowed hard and moved forward, every step heavier than the last. The sound of his breathing filled his ears until he noticed something else. A second set of footsteps, not behind him, beside him. Slow, measured, perfectly in sync. Eric stopped. The other footsteps stopped. His head snapped to the side. Nothing. The hallway remained empty. But when he moved again, the footsteps returned this time, just a fraction of a second behind his own. Following, mirroring, no longer alone. After what felt like an eternity, the hallway opened into a larger room, swallowed in shadow. A single fluorescent light flickered overhead, casting just enough light to reveal the walls were lined with metal filing cabinets. Rows upon rows of them, stretching beyond the light's reach. Eric approached one. The drawer was slightly ajar, and curiosity overpowered his fear. He pulled it open. Inside were dozens of security badges, just like his, each one clipped to a thin manila folder. He picked up the first. David L. Harper, Marketing. Status: deceased. His hand trembled as he flipped to the next. Megan Ruiz, accounting. Status, deceased. Every folder was the same. Hundreds of names. Hundreds of badges. All marked the same way. All gone. Eric's breath quickened. He was holding the evidence of something far larger than him. People disappearing. Erased. And no one knew. Or maybe no one remembered. At the end of the cabinet row, something glinted. A badge. His badge. Pinned to a folder that hadn't been there a second ago. His name stared back at him in bold black letters. Eric Mallory, data analyst. Status. The line beneath it was blank. No deceased. No active. Just empty. Eric's pulse pounded in his ears. Behind him, something shifted. A slow, deliberate sound. Like something standing up. Or unfolding. Eric turned. At the far edge of the flickering light, just beyond the final cabinet, it was waiting. It was taller now, impossibly thin, its limbs stretched like warped shadows. The face, if it could be called that, was still twisted, with that awful, slack grin carved across its face. But now it was wearing something. Pinned to its chest, gleaming faintly in the dim light, was a security badge. His badge. Eric's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The thing raised a hand, a finger too long and thin, and slowly pressed it to where its lips should be. Shh. And then it spoke, a voice like cracked glass and rotting wood. You're already here. The light overhead sputtered once, twice, and then went out. Darkness swallowed everything. Eric stood frozen, unable to see, unable to breathe. The suffocating black pressed in from all sides, heavier than before, thicker. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, but beneath it, something else. The sound of dragging. Slow, deliberate, not footsteps. Something being pulled. Eric's mind screamed at him to move, but his body was anchored in place. His hands trembled, blindly searching the air around him. Cold metal brushed his fingertips, the edge of the filing cabinet. He gripped it tightly, grounding himself, and forced his legs to step backward. But the dragging sound followed. Closer, closer. Then click. A light blinked on ahead, flickering dimly. An elevator. Its doors stood open at the end of the hallway, waiting. But it wasn't the elevator he had arrived in. This one was different, older, rusted. Its doors groaned as they stood ajar. Above it, the panel flickered erratically, displaying no numbers. Just one word. Return. Eric's throat tightened. He didn't want to step forward. But behind him, the dragging stopped. A slow, wet breath filled the silence. Close. So close. He bolted. Eric sprinted toward the waiting elevator, the air growing colder with every step. The lights overhead flickered in rapid bursts, casting fleeting broken images along the walls. For a split second, in the corner of his vision, he saw them. Faces. Dozens. Hundreds. Pressed against the walls, peering from cracks in the floor. Eyes wide and mouths frozen in silent screams. Their badges dangled from torn clothes, swaying as they reached out in desperation. Eric didn't stop. The elevator doors began to close. No. He dove forward, slamming his shoulder into the narrowing gap. The doors groaned and hesitated, then slowly reopened. Inside, the walls were covered in deep scratches, long gouges torn into the metal. At the center of the floor lay a single untouched folder. Eric's name. He didn't look inside. He didn't need to. He slammed the close button, his fists pounding against the controls. The doors creaked shut. Darkness. Then the elevator shuddered violently and began to descend. But there were no numbers on the panel. No lights. Just the sensation of falling. Deeper. Farther. As the elevator plunged, Eric pressed himself into the corner, his breath ragged, eyes locked on the doors. Then, a soft chime. Ding. The door slid open. But this wasn't the lobby. This wasn't anywhere. An endless void stretched before him. And suspended in the black, far in the distance, was another elevator, its doors slowly opening. And inside, Eric saw himself, staring back. But the reflection didn't move the way he did. It smiled and beckoned him forward. Eric stepped back, but the elevator behind him groaned, the walls beginning to close in, tightening like a throat. There was nowhere left to go. The other Eric raised a finger to its lips. Shh, and then spoke. It's your turn now. The elevator jolted, and Eric began to fall again. This time he knew there was no bottom.
Thank you for watching, liking, commenting, and subscribing.